Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Sarah Harris. I am President and CEO of the Black Business Association, and we're so appreciative and welcoming to our partner, Morgan Stanley, for coming together to present part two in our series for our legacy building series and summit, the summit that will be on March 4th. And we are presenting here today part two on scaling with capital and resources. And so our speaker, Mr. Rashawn Coleman, will present with you today. We also want to thank our community partner, National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Los Angeles chapter, for their participation to help share and work with us on this. So we thank them. But without further ado, we want to get going on here, and I'll hand it over to you, Rashad.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm excited to be back here. Hopefully, for those who were able to join last week, you got something out of that. Today is more so centered just around, the capital conversation. I think there's a lot of confusion about the different options that are available. I want to make sure just to keep this very open conversation. I think there's a lot of questions that could be asked just around, deciding, how much capital you need, what are the options for it. So the slide is very basic, just like last week. We got to get through all the legal mumbo jumbo disclosures and all that stuff. But I really wanted to keep it very, very basic. So if there's any questions, we can kind of address that. So I'm excited to be here. This is the second part of our series. The next one is next week. And then the in-person summit is going to be March 4th. So we're excited for that. But, just to kick it off, is there any questions right off the bat, maybe that I can address? Or just, what people want to hear about? All right, I think I'll just go ahead and get started here. So, first thing I wanted to put up here is just kind of the life cycle of an entrepreneur. So, this is a Morgan Stanley slide. We obviously have an investment bank. So, for a lot of the business owners that we work with and founders, their main objective is to raise capital, right? To fund, an idea initially. And then as they're growing the business, they're really trying to expand market share, really trying to understand what products ultimately are going to give them the best chance to raise revenues and increase profitability. So this really just kind of goes through what that typical process looks like. So you have, the angel round. So that's when you're usually, raising capital through equity. Sharon, do you have a question? Sorry, I want to make sure I'm following here. Maybe not. Okay. So, angel round is kind of where everything starts when you're raising equity. Usually when you have the lowest valuation, so that's when you're giving up the most equity. And we'll kind of dive in to the differences between, debt and equity. Debt, I'm sure everyone is aware, is the cheapest cost. Equity can be pretty expensive, but, for a lot of startups, equity is kind of the only option available to them. So it really goes into those early rounds, raising equity, liquidity event that could, be selling to a public company or going public yourself. That's, I just really kind of wanted to lay that out here. Business structure is important. We touched on that last week. Just partnerships, C Corps, S Corps, LLCs. This is a great slide that kind of highlights the different reasons and why business owners choose each structure. So I just wanted to, go through that pretty quickly. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions on this, but this is kind of the main page for today that I want to dive into. And another thing, and I mentioned it earlier, a lot of what we discussed and a lot of the questions you have, you're not going to see the exact answers on the slides. So hopefully you have your notepad ready, because I want to really dive into just all the different ways that we can look at this. So just starting off with the whole debt and equity conversation. So as I mentioned, debt is usually the cheapest, and the reason that is because essentially how much you're borrowing, how much you'll have to pay back, right? In some ways it could be a fixed charge, if you will, whereas equity, right, you're giving up a piece of ownership in your company, right? So whoever that equity partner is, and hopefully you chose the right one, they are participating in the upside of your business, right? So if you have a great year, right, and you raise revenues by 30%, right, and profitability, your equity partner is going to participate in whatever equity percentage they have. So oftentimes what you see people do when they grow, when they become more profitable, they usually switch to a debt vehicle to essentially buy out that equity partner so they can retain more of the upside. And that's really kind of where I wanted to start, because those are the two main ways to finance your company. There is kind of an in-between, so there's debt instruments that kind of operate similar to equity instruments. We won't dive into that today. I just want everyone to know that's an option. And just as far as debt, so if we're just sticking on the debt side today, and before I do that, any questions on what I just said describing the differences between debt and equity? Okay, I don't want to feel like I'm rambling, so please stop me if I'm going all over the place here. So debt. So anytime we think of debt, and we're starting there because it's the cheapest option for you, as I mentioned. So when we think of debt, really three options that you can think of. So there's the term debt. So that's usually a loan that's in the vicinity of 10 to 15 years. Sometimes it could be longer if you're purchasing real estate with the debt. That's a great option, right? Now, you have your lines of credit. So that could be a bunch of different things. That could be just a business line of credit that you can get from a bank. That could be a home equity line of credit that you can get from a bank as well, obviously leveraging your home, and we'll get to that here in a moment. Then there's business credit cards, which, the real reason that, business credit cards should be used is really just for, day-to-day operating expenses, right? You really don't want to hold or, invest in a project and put that on a business credit card. That's really not the right structure for that, because it's usually the highest cost. So business credit cards are usually the highest cost. Then it goes, credit lines, so business credit lines, and then term loans usually have the lowest cost, and those structures are usually fixed over time. So you really want to think about it in that way. So if you want to invest in a longer term project, mainly want to use a term loan for that. We'll dive into the different options there. Line of credit. Line of credit is really good for any working capital needs, purchasing inventory. A lot of times what you'll see is that as your business grows, you'll obviously need to reinvest in the business, purchase more inventory, establish working capital. So you want to really use a line of credit for that. And then business credit cards, I mean, that's really day-to-day stuff. You want to keep that as minimal as possible, because that's going to be the highest interest rate for you on the debt side. So any questions on that? Mika's joining. Promised I was going to get Karen to ask a question today, so hopefully I can. She's still on mute, so that's okay. So that's the debt side. The equity side, a little bit more complex. What you typically see is, you want to raise, if you're basically giving up equity in your company, you're bringing on a partner to your company. And you want to really raise enough capital on the equity side to where it's the minimum you need. Because as I mentioned, the earlier you raise capital, the lower your business valuation is. right? So you're giving up more of your company. As you continue to grow and you raise the same amount of capital through equity, usually you're getting more favorable terms because your value has increased. You're more profitable, you're increasing revenues, you have established market share. So that's really key there. Now, there's the whole angel investors conversation that comes up, and I think when it comes to that, if you have someone who is interested in investing in your business and being an equity partner, they really need to be an expert in the space. They need to provide more than capital. I think, as business owners, or at least the ones that we work with, they're kind of open to whoever's willing to give them the capital they need. And that's more of a partnership where you're giving up that upside, as I mentioned earlier. So you really want to have somebody who's an expert in the field, who's been in the space, who's operated in your industry, and then ultimately figure out a way down the line where if they need some liquidity or they want to sell their share, potentially getting a loan kind of to buy them out, reorganizing the capital structure and for a cheaper cost. So that's kind of debt and equity in a nutshell. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or
Yeah,
have any questions?
Rashawn,
Please.
for as far as venture capital and private equity, how does that differ from like traditional bank loans when you're scaling a business?
Incredible question. So venture capital, they're always going to look at basically total addressable market, so TAM. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that term. They're going to see what your market looks like. They're really trying to understand, basically where you're positioned within that market and how much you have to expand, right? So they're going to be an equity partner. They're usually going to get a really good stake in the business. And you really have to have a lot of growth initially, very quickly, for VC capital to make a lot of sense. And private equity, they look at more established businesses. So Morgan Stanley has a private equity fund. We have clients invest in it. We've also had business owners sell to that private equity company as well. Really focused on industries and businesses that are kind of here to stay, right? So your landscaping businesses, your veterinarian care businesses, all these businesses that really don't go anywhere, but what they look for is someone that has a lot of inefficiency in their business. The owner doesn't really have a lot of capital to reinvest back in the business. So private equity comes in, provides, a piece of that, usually purchasing more than 50%. So they're going to be a majority owner. It's important to mention. And they're going to usually want to bring the owner or the founder of whatever that company is. They usually want to keep them on just with the company. They usually give them, there's a new company that's created, they reinvest their equity into the new company. And as the private equity company grows the company, ultimately there's a liquidity event where they either sell to a bigger company or they sell to another private equity fund. So VC is more so it's kind of in a rare space to where they're really looking for fast growth in specific industries. Private equity looks for more established businesses, right, who just need to scale, right? And they have capital that is really more than what banks can provide, right? Because they leverage the other companies that they own. So long answer to your incredible question, Sarah. Basically, banks lend only to what's available for that business, right? Whereas private equity can come in, obtain a loan, right? That's for multiple times what a bank can give one company because they have other companies that they lend against. It's a portfolio of companies, and they're able to provide more capital. The capital can go in a couple different places, right? The capital can go to provide some liquidity to whoever the owner is, right? To whoever that business owner is, so they could take a piece out. They'll basically try to understand the value of the business. They'll give a portion to pay the owner out, a certain percentage. And then the rest of the capital is really to invest back in the business, hiring a new management team, hiring a new sales team. Their goal is to grow revenues, and, cut costs to increase profitability. So that's kind of the main reason of private equity. And they're buying a lot of companies. They do a great job of buying a lot of companies as well.
One more question. A typical rule of thumb when you're trying to determine the value of your company, as far as also how much equity um, you should give up for that, whatever portion you're getting in. How do you determine that?
Yeah, so another great question, Sarah. So next week too, we're going to be diving more into that. I'm going to give kind of a preview of it. So really what you want to look at is kind of starting off with what are the revenues. That's for more of depends on the industry. That's a popular way to start. Is how much, is the company growing via sales? Usually whether it's a strategic acquirer, which is just a bigger business in your industry with a more established, kind of marketing presence, they're looking at how much you're growing and who are your customers, right? And they're usually trying to enter in those markets where they don't have any access to, and you provide value there. So they're going to start out with what are your revenues. They're going to compare your revenues to other revenues, right? And they're going to assign a multiple to that. And they're going to look at also what is your profitability, right? So if a company is growing $10 million a year in revenue, and you have another company that's growing $5 million a year in revenue, but the bigger company has higher profitability, well, they're willing to pay more for that. So it's just a multiple on whatever your profitability is. So EBITDA, so earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization is usually a good place to start. And that's kind of how they identify, what the value of the company is. And then, if you're lucky and you bring in investment bankers, right, you can kind of bid up that price, right? Because the more buyers there are for your business, and if you're marketing your business properly, you're going to have more buyers that are willing to pay for that business, and that's going to increase your multiple as well. So I try to give a short little preview there. I don't want to give too much out for next week because nobody will show up to it if I give it all today. So, but yeah, hopefully I answered that for you, Sarah. Any more questions on that?
That worked for me. We have one more in the chat and then we'll continue on. Would you
Yeah.
advise a LLC to take a securities-based loan to pay off tax obligations just to establish business credit?
Ooh, that's a great question. Who asked that?
That was Linda.
Linda. I love when Linda asks questions because she has some great ones. So great question. So security-based line of credit. So you can actually use that more on the personal side, Linda. And I know it's here and it's confusing. So you can use a business line of credit for the business. You could use a security-based line of credit on the personal side. That's usually leveraging kind of a portfolio that you already have established, whether it's just a regular brokerage account or anything. The bank basically looks at that portfolio of securities and lends probably around 60 to 70% against that value, so loan to value, if you will. Now, to fund the tax obligations, that's one of the ways that people use security-based lines of credit or business lines of credit. And the reason is important. And the reason is that basically, if you're investing in your business or you're investing in a portfolio of securities, first thing you want to ask yourself is how much you're giving up if you liquidate or sell, right, a part of your investment portfolio, right, or how much capital you're tying up from the business, right, in that tax obligation, right? So that's the first thing. So if your business is growing 8 to 10% a year, well, you got to ask yourself, if I take out 40,000, I need to multiply that by, 8 to 10%. Okay, well, that starts to chip away at kind of what your upside is. The other thing is taxes. So in the investment portfolio, taxes play a big part because if you have a huge gain in Apple or something like that, you're not only giving up the upside, but you have to pay taxes on that amount. So what a lot of people do is instead of giving up upside or paying taxes, they just say, let me just borrow against my portfolio, pay the taxes, right? And then I start chipping away back at that line over time. That way you're capturing the upside, you're avoiding the taxes. And the math is, if you're, security-based lines of credit are going for like 6% now. So if you're targeting a 10% return, and obviously you're not paying taxes, and you borrow at 6%, that spread, that 4% spread, is kind of what you're trying to target over time. As rates, if rates continue to go up, it's less attractive. 3-4 years ago, when interest rates were 1%, I mean, that was the hottest thing you could do, was borrow against your securities at 2%, and then you're getting 8-10% on your investments. I mean, it's great, but interest rates have risen over time, so that's narrowed a little bit. So thank you for the question. That's a wonderful question. Do you have a follow-up, Linda?
No, it was just in regards to securing it to pay for the business taxes. Is
Gotcha.
that a way to establish the credit? Don't necessarily need to have a security-based loan to pay the taxes, but if it's an opportunity to build credit for the business, then that's why I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's an opportunity to build credit for the business, but also you want to ask how much you're tying up, in that tax obligation that could be used for other things, right? I mean, if you can grow revenues next year, right, by 20-30%, if you take whatever that tax obligation is and reinvest that back in the business, that's a good deal, right? You got to kind of understand, what kind of your projections look like, and, kind of what your market presence is, and figure out what's the ways that you're expanding, right? Because if you're a manufacturing company and you need more equipment, right, and you have this tax obligation, really you want to use that line of credit maybe for the tax obligation, and take whatever profits that you want to reinvest back in the business, grow the revenues, right? And then you take whatever you got from the revenues and pay that line down over time. That's efficiently using leverage, right? You really want to make sure that you're efficient at using leverage. And that's the risk in it though, right? Because what if you invest all back in your business and, revenues drop, right? We go into a recession or something like that. So that's kind of the risk to think about. But business credit's important. I just want that other element to be known as well, that, reinvesting back in the business, growing profits, taking those profits, paying down the line over time, could be really good for the business. So Sarah asked a question, Linda asked a question. Who else we got?
We'll have more, but we'll proceed for now, and then we'll keep monitoring.
Okay, so I think, like I said, the slides are very basic. I really wanted to cover, obviously debt and equity. Sarah asked a great question about the private equity and VC side. I think now, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit, but wanted to discuss, kind of the options available to do with the capital that you have, right? So, I mentioned it earlier, working capital, right? Being able to pay for, more inventory, being able to do a lot of different things or reinvest back in the business from a working capital standpoint, is really important, because if you want to continue to grow, right, you have to kind of expand your sales, and you have to figure out a way to reduce costs. And I should have said this at the beginning, the best way you can fund your business is from growing profits, right? So if you can figure out how to grow profits and just take the additional profits and reinvest back in the business, that's kind of the first place you want to start. But once there's a point where that plateaus, and you want to think about what are some other sources of capital that I can get to really continue that, because there's only so much profits you can really grow at until you start needing some cash that you don't have on hand. And that's kind of the place to start, because, as I mentioned, especially if your business is more seasonal, if we're at the beginning of the year and revenues, if you looked at your historic numbers. Revenues usually are really good for you around this time of the year, right? Probably need some additional capital to reinvest in, some more, inventory, maybe some more marketing for the company. That way you can take advantage of the seasonal time. The other thing is, really reinvesting back into kind of your capital that you already have. If you have some equipment that breaks down every 5 seconds, I mean, that's not going to be super helpful if you go into a busy time of the year, right? So having an understanding of that, what your existing capital looks like. And then if you already have capital, if you already have bank loans, if you already have a business line of credit, are you getting kind of the most competitive rate there? Because if you're not, you really need to evaluate, what makes the most sense. Because the bank's not going to call you and tell you that, hey, you're being charged 2% more than probably what you should be charged, right? So you got to really investigate as your business is growing, kind of what's the best source of capital that's available for you. So I'm gonna pause there. Any questions in the chat? I can't see the chat, Sarah. So, Lady K gave me a thumbs
Not
up.
at this not at this time.
Up. Okay, the thumbs up went down. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna take a step back here, Sarah, and just try to re-engage the audience here. Who in here from the business owners on the Zoom here, who feels pretty good about their capital structure or their bank loan or anything like that? Can we get a show of hands of that, and just to kind of see?
In terms of raising their hand, who feels good?
Well, yeah, I mean, who feels pretty good about just their capital situation or has a good understanding of what options they have available? Cherie.
No, I'm raising my hand just because I am here just to learn and listen. So I have not yet started my business, and I was invited to this because I'm going to the summit next week. But so I'm listening along. So I am, yeah, that's all I'm doing. I'm learning.
Thank you.
Okay. Absolutely. All right.
And I'm like scratching my head because I'm like, this is really like, ooh.
All right. Well, so let's bring it back, Linda. I appreciate you sharing that. So let's bring it back. So what?
So would we have to already have a capital strategy going on to?
Well, no. I mean, have you approached or used a bank? Let's just start with a bank, right? To fund your business. Have you worked with a bank in regards to your business?
I have literally been funding my business from my own personal resources, so I need a shift.
Hey, but that's okay, because that's how most start, right? So we really want to start there. Okay, so you're funding everything by yourself, right? So the reason that that's good is because you don't set agreement up with yourself to pay yourself back, do you? Right. So you don't have anybody knocking on your door every month saying, hey, I need my monthly payment here, right? So that's good. You have no ties. Now the other question, and here's where it's super important, is how much have you kind of invested from your own personal funds into the business, right, versus how much you need, right? Have you kind of have done any analysis on that as far as, let's just say you put 10,000 in, but you need about 20,000, right? Do you kind of look for other ways to get that, or you just kind of say, I'll do with the 10,000 for now?
I don't know.
And the answer is okay. I mean, if you look, that's because that's what most business owners do, is they say, I only have 10,000 right now. That's all I can really reinvest back in my business. That's great, right? But if you really look at kind of the past numbers, you'll get an understanding of, am I growing kind of the way I need to grow, right? Because the way you got to think about that 10,000 is, how do I double that to 20,000 in my business, right? Because if you plan on doubling that, you might as well just go get more, right? Because the business model works, however it is. I don't know your business, Linda, but if you think about that 10,000, the return on that capital that you put back in the business, if you're getting good returns on your capital and increasing revenues, cutting costs, increasing profitability, chances are, if you go to a bank, right, they're going to look at your business and say, well, you're undercapitalized. Maybe we can extend you a business line of credit, 20, 30,000, so you can expand operations into different markets or anything like that. So the important thing is the analysis that is always important is to see, how much am I putting back in my business versus how much it needs to get to where I ultimately want to go, right? So, sorry, what were you going to say, Linda?
So I was thinking more of self-funding my business, like putting 20, 30,000 somewhere in a chase and then saying, give me whatever I need, which means that I have front-loaded my own success.
Yeah, which if you can continue to do that, right, that's great, right? Because you don't have to sit there and deal with the interest charges every month. You don't have to pay down the loan within a certain short time frame. The thing is that you want to track is how much are your revenues, how much are your profits growing over time, and then you don't really have to fund anymore because you just take the growth in profits and reinvest it back into the business, right? So you don't have to keep taking money and just putting it back in the business. You start kind of calculating, okay, how is my revenue, how have my profits increased from last year? I'm going to take a certain percentage of that and I'm going to reinvest back in the business, right? I'm going to make it more efficient to where I'm going to get a new machine, right? Or I'm going to, reach out to, someone who can help with my marketing presence, right? And then you just kind of calculate how much that increases revenues over time. You take a share of that and reinvest back in the business. Yeah. Right. So that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. If you're self-funding, great, right? But obviously that becomes a burden over time because I'm sure you want to go on vacation. I'm sure you've got family that you want to hang out with, right? So you got to figure out just kind of a business plan on what do the profits look like? How much are they growing? How much can I take from the profits and reinvest back in the business? Or if you're comfortable where the business is, you start to return some of that capital to yourself. And it's just thinking through that, right? That's an option, and that's an okay option, right? There's nothing bad about that. You don't have to go to a bank to, do all this stuff. It just depends on what your growth targets are and where you want to hit. So, Sarah, do you have anything else you want to add on that?
Wonderful.
Well, I was going to ask about metrics in terms of what key financial metrics that business owners can track to measure their scaling success.
Yeah.
Is there anything related to that you can provide?
Yeah, so great question. First is just looking at your revenues, right? And really looking at it from a monthly number and then looking at it from an annual number. So annually, are you increasing? Monthly, is it steady? Is it steady growth? If it's not, then you probably have some seasonality in your revenues that you want to address. We talked about it last week, but in those months or seasons where revenue is a little lower, you probably want to lower some of the variable costs, right? The marketing costs that you do in a year that's not, really busy for you, the extra cost that you probably can cut, right? And increase revenues more. So starting with revenues, how much are they growing? Is it steady throughout the month? And then looking at your cost structure, right? If your revenues are growing and your costs are growing as well, your profitability stays the same, right? But if your revenues are growing and your costs stay flat or they go down, that's when you start to get the acceleration in the profitability. And that's key because, to what Linda and I were discussing, you take those profits, you start coming up with kind of an expansion plan on what you want to do with those profits. You want to hire more people to help with marketing. You want to hire, do you want to build out inventory? Do you want to purchase real estate to really have more capacity to take on new orders if you're a distribution company, or to hold, whatever product you have. That's when you really start to ask yourself, okay, my profitability is going up. Unless I'm paying that out to myself, how can I reinvest that in the business? And the more you're earning on an after-tax basis before you're paying back any business loans, right? The more you're earning, if your capital stays the same, well, that means your return on capital increases, right? And that's a line that you really want to understand is, are my revenues increasing? Am I cutting costs? Is my profitability going up? And how much did I take on to really do all of that? If you kept the capital the same and you increase your profitability, that increases what's called the return on invested capital. And that's a key metric that I think every business owner should look at. Because, it's not just your business. You look at Apple, you look at Amazon, any of those companies, that's what metrics they look at. They ask themselves, okay, did we increase profits? How much extra capital did we need to do that? Because if you increase profits by 20%, but you increase the amount of capital that you took on by 20%, right, it's not that great. But, if you increase profits by 20 and you took on 10% extra capital, whether through a bank loan or, you sold equity to someone, that's pretty good. So that's a key metric.
Are there in what areas or where, kind of trying to ask this question, where is it that you find that most small businesses who aren't either taking advantage of or utilizing different tools or ways to expand and scale their business? What areas are you seeing them not taking advantage of? And is there any indication as to why you think that is?
Yeah, technology. I think technology is big. I think a lot of the ways that data is stored is very archaic. But it's because technology is kind of a very complex thing to think about for a business owner who's been doing something the way they've done it for as long as they've known, right? So figuring out ways to track a lot of information, to have an idea of how much inventory you have so you don't overpay for more inventory, right? Understanding how much, your labor costs are relative to how much you're actually bringing in. A lot of that stuff can really be outsourced through technology and having good, data to really track and measure over time. That way you're keeping your revenues growing consistently and you're keeping costs low. That's a big thing, right? Another thing is like we were talking about with Linda, right? A lot of businesses are undercapitalized, right? Because they don't know that what all options are available. They have to go to the big bank. They have to see how much the bank is going to give them. And then they're very tied to how much they have to pay back every month. So they're worried because they're hoping they hit revenues, right? And they're hoping they're profitable enough to pay the interest back, right? And there's some other structures, SBA loans, right? That's an incredible, tool that I think a lot of business owners don't utilize. And the reason is because bank loans are more shorter term, right? So you have to pay back the interest in a quicker fashion rather than SBA loans, which are government backed, right? Give you more flexible repayment terms. That way, less of your monthly cash flow is going to pay down interest, right? It could be towards, purchasing more inventory. It could be towards hiring more staff, right? It could be towards, a lot of different things, replacing equipment. So that's one thing. And, I think it's a marketing thing too, right? There's a bunch of stuff you can do with Google now. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with Yelp that really kind of put you out there and do some market research on who your target customer is and how you can reach them, right? We all know that if we say, we just got our son an Elmo toy this past weekend for Valentine's Day. If we said Elmo once, and all of a sudden there's like 5 ads on Instagram that are Elmo.
Right.
So
I know they're listening to us.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're listening. So that's type of stuff that you can see, and marketing and sales is a very good way to increase profits because that increases the number of customers that you have. The last thing that I'll say, pricing. And we talked about it last week. I mean, if you're not pricing well, it doesn't matter how much work you're doing. If it's not priced properly, you're missing out on a huge amount of revenues.
Oh, you're touching on something. So, I mean, in terms of, it also means knowing your value.
Exactly.
Because a lot of times when we price things, especially when we're in the service sector,
Yeah,
it's a lot trying to you know, be in a place where you won't get much rub back. But at the same time, you got to really know your value and go with it. I felt so good when I got to a point where for my services, this is my price and I'm not budgeting,
yeah,
right? And then it just becomes accepted and to go with it. And then you understand it's really you're your own barrier on that, right? Although you do need to know market, right? You do need to understand where you are relative into the market, but at the same time, a big part of that is knowing your value. So,
absolutely.
yeah, you touched the big one on pricing because a
Absolutely.
lot of times we undercut ourselves, or either when we go and especially supporting for Black owned um, and expecting a deal or what have you, right? But you're not really helping the whole ecosystem and all of that,
Exactly.
So that's a big
Exactly.
one.
Well,
um,
that's a huge plug for the new platform you guys have that shares resources of Black-owned businesses here locally.
mhm, mhm.
Um, the network effect, I think, is very important, right? Because you have people that really are invested in your success. I mean, you're going to grow, they're going to grow. That's kind of the whole thing of the game.
Yeah, indeed. I'll let you kind of, if you have anything else to present here, but I just want to iterate right here that not everything are you going to capture in these three virtual sessions. Um, we will have a larger team at the summit, so there'd be more opportunity, especially for one-on-ones as well. But this is an ongoing conversation and learning information because there's a variety of different options, resources, everything, right? It's hard to just touch upon everything. And I had mentioned this before that I participated in a home ownership summit, and the speaker there, he has a home counseling organization. And with that, he's able to um, provide the landscape opportunities, right? And so it's just important to get with a representative, get with someone to get counsel on this, right? Create that relationship, stay in touch, and continue to get more and more information because you can't glean it all in just these few sessions. So I'm
Mhm.
gonna get off my soapbox, but it
So,
really starts with that creating that relationship and getting that information to get the landscape of all the different opportunities.
yeah, no, that's a great point. I think unless we have any questions, I was just going to give a few kind of things that we've seen as far as capital, the unique solutions. But there's no questions in the chat, right, Sarah?
No questions.
Okay. So I do want to touch on Sarah asked a great question when we first started planning for this about acquisitions. So, mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of people think that because, if you're in the smaller space for your business, that there's no way to really collaborate, merge with another company, or even acquire another company. But, there's plenty of chances to do it. I mean, you see a lot of business brokers, they deal with the smaller businesses. Um, a lot of these business owners that are in your industries, whatever industry you're in, they're retiring, they've had health issues, they don't want to do the business anymore. A lot of them are selling their businesses, right? They have existing customers, they have existing process, they have existing equipment. One of the things I think that capital really can be used for is acquiring some of these smaller businesses and rolling them into your own business. Excuse me. Sarah knows that I'm a little sick today. So I think that's something that, everyone needs to be aware of. Capital isn't just for reinvesting back in your own business. If there's a business in the service industry that has an existing client base that's going for 500,000, you can obtain some capital to purchase that business, right? And there's ways to do that. And what happens when you purchase that business is you have that existing client base. You've entered into a new market. You can cross-sell any services that previous business didn't do. And that is a very easy way to grow revenues while also, being able to cut costs in many ways. So, that's a big thing that we see a lot of people doing. There's very easy ways to do that. Sometimes you can do that with very minimal costs, because you can essentially borrow from whoever the seller is. It's called a seller's note. And they're going to be able to fund you with whatever down payment you need to purchase the business. So, there's very creative ways to do that. You see a lot of companies that, are in fragmented industries. A great example is a landscaping business, right? Really good friend of mine, he started his own landscaping business, has done incredible. He got pricing right. He got the cost right. He understands the marketing. He's been able to get on a bunch of new contracts recently. And probably the next step for him is looking out and seeing, what other businesses are out there that could really roll up into his existing business so he can expand market share, he can have a labor force, and really expand operations, right? That's a really great way to grow revenues and cut costs and ultimately increase profitability. So, that I just wanted to touch on that. Another thing, to Linda's point in our conversation earlier, if you have your house fully paid off, and we've seen this at the smaller business level, we've seen this at the multi-million, business level, you can put a mortgage on your house, right, to get the lowest cost that you need, right? A lot of people say, why would I do that? I own my house free and clear, all that stuff. Well, if it's better than, going to a bank and getting, interest that's in the 12-15%, right, range, if you could instead put a mortgage on your already paid for house and get 6%, well, that lowers your interest cost, right? So that's a very valuable thing that a lot of people do, right? Because usually, if you're doing well or you bought your house a long time ago, you usually pay cash for it. Or if you've been successful throughout your career, you've already paid cash for it. But that's a very valuable resource because it's illiquid asset. So if you want any type of liquidity from it, you have to sell it, right? Nobody wants to sell their house. So what's the next best thing? Put a mortgage on it, get a lower interest rate to accomplish that. So, that's one thing. Linda also mentioned the security-based lending. So, if your business isn't established, right, but you've been pretty successful throughout your career, you've developed a great, investment portfolio, you can borrow against your investments, right? I think that's a great choice to do if alternative forms of financing are more expensive. And then the last thing I was going to say, accounts receivable financing. So if you're a startup, right, and you haven't been operating for longer than 2 or 3 years, right, it's pretty tough to kind of get that bank relationship established. But there's some firms out there that really look at, whatever your accounts receivable are, you essentially sell them kind of the rights to that. They give you cash up front, right? And that can be used for working capital, as I mentioned. It could be for maintenance. It could be for, product expansion, research and development. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could be used for. So I rambled a lot there. I wanted to save the last 7 minutes or 6 minutes for questions. I know we kind of went over a lot. Linda, I hope we kind of got you back on track. I know everything was kind of going over your head, but that wasn't the goal today. I know we're not going to solve the capital issues in one 50-minute presentation here, but hopefully this was helpful. So any questions?
I don't really have a question, more of a comment that, just thank you for this beneficial information. That's what we do at my organization, help business owners, break through the microaggressions and all of the things that deter us from funding. So, these are really great tools that I can continue to share with them and also implement in my own business. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Oh, it's my pleasure. I didn't see who asked that, Sarah.
Keisha,
Oh,
Keisha,
awesome.
Collier, Lady K. Is it
Thank you,
Kisha or
lady. I
Keisha?
appreciate that.
You can call me Lady K, but it is Keisha.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
thank you, Lady K. I really appreciate that. It means a lot.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This was very helpful, especially about taking out a mortgage on your home to reduce your interest on payments. Yes. People think of that as like a long-term um, thing, but if it's going to save you money in the end, also too, doesn't mean you need to keep it for that long. You can work to pay it off sooner and save money at the same time. So,
Cool. That's what a lot of business owners do when they, obviously, when you own a business, it's not readily, able to sell. So ultimately,
mhm.
if you're planning on selling the business, you've grown it, which we'll talk about next week, but if you've grown it enough where you're going to sell it, you could sell it and pay off the mortgage with the proceeds.
Okay, wonderful. So for next week, um,
Cherie had her
if
hand
I'm
up, Sarah.
Yes,
who did
I just wanted to ask a question, and it's sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of quite a deep question. Do you think that it's part of our culture as Black people that we're almost afraid to be indebted, so we avoid?
Yeah. Yes.
Because I think there's something about I want to own something fair and square. I don't want to have to go, and there's almost that fear, even though it is like you say, that investment in the future. I don't want
Yeah.
to say everything,
Well,
but I just wonder if there's a sort of my background is education, so I'm thinking
yeah.
of that from an education sort of
Well,
environment as well.
great question. Obviously, this is more, I guess, abstract. I do think that is the case, and the reason is because years and years and centuries and generations of just kind of bad relationship with financial institutions. I mean, let's just be real, right? I don't want to go into the whole history of it, but our people have been manipulated, unfortunately, and it's kind of created a distrust with financial institutions, and I do still think a lot of that stuff goes on under the table, and that's unfortunate. But I do think that we have to do a better job of having an understanding of what the options are. And it's not on kind of the business owners. I mean, it's having people on the other side that look like us, right? And hopefully I'm serving my role in that capacity. But I do think that is the case, right? We've developed a mistrust for financial, institutions because we weren't aware of certain fees that we were charged, probably shouldn't have been charged those fees anyway. So there's reasons for that. I don't think that certain financial products have been explained properly. And there was a misunderstanding. So there's a lot of ways for that. But what I will say is that we are in a different time. There is a lot of information available to us, and we have to understand both the risks and the rewards, right? And I hope that no one sits there and hears me on this call and thinks that I'm leaning towards one thing or one institution or anything like that, because there's a lot of people out there that do a lot of great things, and there's people that don't do such great things, right? But at the end of the day, as long as you have enough information to make an informed decision, I think that it's helpful. Leverage, and I'll probably, just to close your question with this, leverage is a really good thing, but it's also a really bad thing. And it depends on the scenario you're in. Whether it's a business, whether it's an investment, whether it's buying a home, right? It's great if there's upside, it's terrible if there's downside. Because at the end of the day, if there's downside, you still owe the money, but if there's upside, you only pay whatever portion you owe, right? So as long as you understand the scenarios for your business, right? If you're going into a year where you're not sure revenues are going to be as good, right? You probably want to reduce some debt a little bit, right? That interest expense is probably going to eat away at profits that have already decreased. To answer your question on the mortgage, only reason you should put a mortgage on your house is if you can't get cheaper financing elsewhere, right? If you can get cheaper financing elsewhere, right, take it, because that's a huge asset your home is. It depends, right? What are the other options available and how much are they willing to give you? If they're only going to give you $15,000, well, guess what? If that's not going to help your business, then yeah, the mortgage might make some sense for the cost. So it's just weighing those different options. But I appreciate the question. I hope
Thank you.
no one feels like I hope no one feels like we're Morgan Stanley and this is recorded and we can't ask tough questions, because I think that's the whole point of this. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rashawn, for a great presentation and answering all of our questions. And next week, we are coming back at you with, let's see, on the 19th, the 26th at 10 a.m. It will be on succession planning and legacy building. So join us back for that for next week. And then we're going to be looking forward to seeing you on March 4th for our in-person summit, where it's going to be a much more engaging time in terms of having more team members there, experts to give more information and that one-on-one time. So we look forward to seeing you next week at 10 a.m. and stay in touch with the BBA. If you want to keep in touch with us with updated information at bbala.org. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.